Red Cave Podcast. Reading tonight from Tales from the Cracks, numbers 51 through 54. Starting with The Count, followed by The Campground, and concluding with Helsing and the Count, parts 1 and 2. The place was dark and dusty and half lost, in tangles of old alleys near the quays, reeking of strange things brought in from the seas, and with queer curls of fog that west winds tossed. H.P. Lovecraft. The Count. His father was cutting him down again, all the while avoiding his eyes and gripping the steering wheel with rock hands. The boy was afraid of being struck in these frequent circumstances, but his father rarely raised his fist with harmful intent. It was just the man's body language that scared the boy. His face would turn red and all the unseen muscles would stand up underneath his clothes. Muscles the boy had never expected to see on a human body. His father would rant and rave with the sharpest of voices. His threats were always meaningless, but the boy could never get past that harsh, jagged tone. He wondered if that was what God's voice had sounded like in the Bible's Old Testament. Had Adam and Eve quaked with the same primal fear as he did every Sunday night he forgot to take out the trash? They must have known that God could strike them down any minute, but the voice was enough to send them packing. It was when the wrath didn't come that they were scared the most, the boy figured that day in the car. Threats are threats, yet without that booming voice in the muscles, nobody would ever take anyone seriously. The boy had gotten into another fight at school. One of his classmates had called him a pussy, and he responded by pushing the boy down a flight of concrete steps in the schoolyard. The injured classmate would need a cast and several stitches. "You have to pick your battles, son," his father said. When the boy made no response, he continued, "I know that you're going to get into scuffles. All young boys should, at least the straight ones. You just have to know your limits. You can't actually injure your opponent that bad. You just knock him down and pin him there for a while until he gives in. It's when you're throwing kids downstairs that you've gone too far. Hey, are you listening?" The boy had actually been listening, but he shook his head anyway. "Listen, goddammit," there was that voice. The boy didn't know why he provoked antagonism whenever with his father. Maybe it was because he was receiving personal attention from his parent, even if it was negative. Or maybe it was because he just liked to feel his heart race. For some reason he liked being the victim, and succumbing to the bigger, better man whenever the opportunity arose. He had no problem admitting he was the weaker of the two, but if he knew he was stronger, like with the kid who had called him a pussy, he was going to prove his position, and for once look down over the victim. "You can't put someone's life on the line for some childish squabble, you hear me?" This time the boy nodded. "Pick your battles, don't be a pussy, and for God's sake, kid, don't draw too much attention to yourself, especially when you're doing something bad. I'm not condoning criminal activity here, but watch your back. Sometimes it's better to trust yourself." "Yes, Dad." His father relaxed back in his seat and finally looked at his son. He patted his arm. The car came to a jerky halt before a red light. The father cursed under his breath, but his temper wouldn't flare any further for the afternoon. He turned up the radio and began drumming on his steering wheel. He watched through the windshield as a biker mounted the crosswalk, his head low and his legs pumping. They both watched him as he passed the hood of their car. The father whistled along with the radio, and once more looked to his son. This time he was smiling. "You're a good kid, but you have a lot to learn." The light turned green and the boy had to nudge his dad. The father cursed again, and when he peered back through the windshield, he caught sight of the biker just as he was arcing through the air, with his helmet and wheels spinning in opposite directions. The father and his son watched a car screech to a smoky standstill, and the biker smacked the road as a wet and broken doll. They saw it all. The father jerked in his seat, his hands ready to tear the entire steering column off his dash. He let out a girlish shriek before reeling toward his son with his eyes like windows. The boy wasn't looking at his dad. He couldn't take his eyes off the mass of broken bones and limbs in the middle of the intersection. Suddenly, the boy began to laugh. The father fell back against the driver door, his mouth open. His son was rocking in his seat, beating at his knees with his fists, eyes spurting tears. The boy laughed harder and harder, kicking at the glove compartment with his dusty little shoes. The father didn't know what to do. He was completely lost for words. A man was dead or dying in the street, and his son, his own flesh and blood, was laughing like a madman. Something wasn't right. The man reached over and struck his son across the mouth. The kid instantly went quiet, hands clinging to his lips. He was blinking painful tears out of his eyes. "What's the matter with you?" the father yelled as he fumbled with the handle to the car door. "What is so fucking funny?" Without another word, the father wrenched the parking brake down and sprinted across the street, to disappear into the circle of gawking people, one of which was the driver from the blood-splattered car, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs. The boy didn't move. He was overcome with feelings of shame and alienation. His joy was replaced with a new wave of fury toward his father and the biker. He felt he had done nothing wrong. He didn't necessarily know why he had laughed. It had just happened, like a reflex or a sneeze. Why should he be punished for something he could not control? And why should his father be so concerned for the biker? It was not his responsibility to look after a dying man. It was neither of their problems. A kid at his school once said that hundreds of people die every day. So why should they drop everything? Why should they care? But one thing was apparent for the boy. Sure, hundreds of people might die every day, but it wasn't every day that death showed its face in his own life. It was his first introduction to the mortality of man, and he had laughed. Years later, he would say that everything about death was funny, the fear of it, the hope for it, and even the celebration of it. He might even lose his cool right then and there, throwing his head back in a childish show. He would say that he had laughed because the man had probably had a life of his own, complete with a family and a house, yet he had woken up that morning knowing that he was about to take his final bike ride. The humor was in the simplicity of it all. The man had built up a life for himself, with hard effort and numerous risks. He had made mistakes, made love, and had saved up all his money for an unseen future. And it had all been for nothing. It had been in vain. He had worried, cried, loved, and searched for nothing, because all of it had led up to that final altercation with the car. For the boy, this realization was hilarious. No matter how much he could hope to accomplish in his own life, there was still the possibility he could be struck by a car crossing an intersection, to end up as meat splattered on the asphalt. What had the man been thinking about just before he died? The boy wondered if any of that mattered now. That was the stuff of God's wrath. He had his ways of distracting the man with pain and love, so that when the car decided to speed his way, he wouldn't see it coming. There was no way to stop it or pinpoint it. Everybody could leave the world in the same way as the biker, in one fatal rush of blood and smoke. The ambulance arrived and the cars cleared out. The father slinked back into the car and didn't say a thing. The boy didn't say a thing. His father was awkwardly slumped in his seat, all the lines in his face sagging, as though his skin was about to slide off his skull. They were both surprisingly calm up until dinner time, when the news came on, and the boy had to escape to his room, so that he could safely laugh into his pillow without the fear of punishment. He liked it better when there was no barbed wire behind the booming voice. He liked to feel his heart race without the prospect of retaliation, because it was only when the fury didn't come that he had a chance to wait up every sleepless night, wondering when the lightning would strike. Now that was purpose. In the passenger seat of Tom's Jeep, the hitchhiker smoothed the newspaper out over the dashboard and used a finger to guide his eyes. The straw from his extra-large soda danced between his lips with vigorous mastication. Tom gave him a sideways glance, and the kid relaxed in his seat, glaring fixedly out the windshield. "Can you believe what's going on out there? In the city?" He tapped the newspaper. "It's tragic, don't you think? I mean, an old woman? What's the motivation? It just seems so... Meaningless," Tom added. "Yeah. What does this Count guy want anyway? Attention? Some way to go about it?" Tom flipped on his turn signal and quickly changed lanes. They sped past a rowing semi before migrating back over. "Maybe there is no reason," Tom said. "Then why do it? I think he's trying to send us a message." "How do we know he isn't a she?" Tom pressed. He often wondered why the media had automatically assumed the killer had to be a male. He agreed that if history had anything to say, it was that white men insisted on washing their hands with blood, but did that make it true for every scenario? The young man laughed at Tom's question, and in the process, almost choked on his straw. "A woman? Yeah, right. I've never heard of a female serial killer. Have you?" "Not exactly, but there are prisons packed with women. It happens every day." "Those are just the chicks that couldn't stand their husbands anymore. They pulled the trigger once. Only a man could be sick enough to bleed a body and stick pushpins into their skin. Women are, in a sense, stable." "Women are stable?" Tom scoffed. "And we aren't?" "No, we aren't," the kid said with a smile. "I took a few psychology classes in college, and it's true that men are more likely to fall into mental illness. Males have only one X chromosome to receive the proper amount of information, and women have two. So they have twice as many chances to turn out right than we do." Tom ignored the road and eyed the hitchhiker carefully. "Why do you think that someone has to be insane to kill?" The man felt Tom's gaze and turned into it. "He has to be insane. No one in their right mind would leave such carnage for the media. I believe that people are reasonably good below the surface, but that Count dude has me questioning mankind as I know it. That's not a good feeling." The kid extended his legs and yawned. "Plus, women are what make humankind a beautiful thing. That and art. Without the yin to our yang, it would be a man's world, and we'd be extinct within the first century." "Yeah, because there would be no women to mate with," Tom said. The kid chuckled. "Well, of course you're right. I mean, we'd all kill each other." "Wake up. Woman or no woman, it's already happening. This is an evil world." "Who can you depend on, really?" Tom asked the hitchhiker. The kid only smiled and looked away. Nothing I have to say could ever change your mind. Nothing can argue with what's going on out there, he said, tapping the passenger window. You might say ugly, but I say yes, ugly, but hopeful. Tom was lost in thought, in another time, sitting in the passenger seat of his father's car. Sometimes the only person you can trust is yourself, Tom's father had told him all those years ago. Hey, are you reading this? The man turned around in his seat to select something from the back. He returned with a paperback book, tattered and worn. Dracula? Is this good? Of course, it's one of the greatest classics of all time. It just seems that I could recite the entire plot without ever reading it. I mean, Dracula's become such a cliché. It's been done to death. It had to start somewhere, and that's it. Tom pointed a finger at the cover. I know there's a castle, and a guy hunts down Dracula since he's the head vampire. He pries open the casket and hammers a stake into Dracula's heart. Actually, there are a group of men that hunt down Dracula, and they don't ever reach the castle. They intercept him before he can get there, aboard a mule cart inside a box of earth. They slit his throat with a knife and stab him in the chest. The hitchhiker did not reply. He placed the book on the dash and folded his arms. I keep thinking about those victims, he finally said, hanging his head. Yeah, but you already know the ending. They catch the bad guy, right? Here, drop me off at this gas station, the kid said, pointing his finger through the windshield. You've taken me far enough. Tom nodded and veered off onto the exit ramp. He parked beside an unattended pump and killed the engine. They made eye contact and both smiled. Thanks again, man. You've been great, the kid handed over the newspaper. Keep it, Tom said. There's nothing in there for me. The hitchhiker set out across the blacktop, the paper rolled up in his fist. Tom stepped out of the car and watched the kid go. He decided he could use a pit stop, so he ducked into the convenience store to find the restroom. When finished, he walked back out into the sun and stopped. His Jeep was gone. He went rooting through his pockets and cursed. His car keys were nowhere on his person. He had left them in the ignition. He took a seat on the curb and shaded his eyes. Something was there beside the pump. He darted over to the spot and picked up the newspaper. He tucked the paper underneath his arm and spat into the wind. Don't! The voices bounced carelessly across the gully, duplicating and thinning, sharpening and dying. It was 1 a.m. The white pickup truck was parked on the shoulder just over their heads. The woman soaked her body in the 2 inches of water, choking on her words. Tom wielded a shovel he had fetched from the back of the truck. He had already struck the woman once by the road. She had rolled down the gully to rest with her fat belly exposed and her pants caked with mud. You thought you were only picking up a hitchhiker this afternoon, and you got a bad guy instead. The same thing happened to me. I was screwed over, and by chance, you were too. No! Breathing hard and using the shovel as a support, he climbed back to the edge of the road. By 2 a.m. that morning, he was just leaving the state of Texas. The campground. A family gathered over a bed. A distressed daughter clutched at wrinkled bed sheets. Somewhere inside the tight space, someone sniffed and chairs groaned under dead weight. The TV and CD player were left off. Most assuredly music would be playing if somebody had thought to bring something. So the family sat in silence. 2 daughters, 2 husbands, a couple friends, and 1 grandson. The grandson was tucked in the back corner of the hospital room, lying awkwardly on his back, his jacket rolled up like a pillow under his head. He was tired of watching the emaciated chest rise and fall, rise and fall. He was too busy studying the ceiling, counting the tiles. After all, he could hear the ragged breathing. As long as there was breathing, there was sure to be movement on the bed. The boy had first stared at his grandmother for a long 15 minutes from one of the uncomfortable reclining chairs. He was so horrified by what he was seeing, he couldn't even look away. When he was finally able to turn his head, it was once he realized the woman lying in the hospital bed was his own grandmother. This was the woman he saw every Christmas, the woman who spoiled him rotten every chance she got. And now he loomed over her as a sad visitor, watching her at her worst. She couldn't get any older, and she certainly couldn't get any sicker. There was nowhere else she could go. She would never be able to leave the bed and go home like the family would have wanted. That thought provoked the first series of tears from the grandson. He departed from the bedside and took a seat, hiding his face in his hands. He was aware that his mother and father were staring at him, so he buried his face even deeper. The world went black, but remnants of his surroundings held fast to the outskirts of his vision. All that was left was the sharp hiss of oxygen through plastic tubing and his grandmother's resonant snore. When his fingers unhinged, the dim light crept in. He knew he couldn't stay in that chair. He had too clear a view of the bed. The grandson bounded to his feet and slid down to the far wall to collect inside a fetal ball. From that position, all he could make out were limbs, exaggerated in size and length, winding over the bedspread and gently smoothing the fabric flat. In the hours that crept by, his family members perused in and out of the hospital room to catch some precious hallway air or some water from the neighboring drinking fountain. Yet he never left the room. He didn't watch his grandmother, but he stayed on the floor, listening to her sonorous breathing. And when a breath came a little late in the series, his own breath would stall in his throat. 1,000 thoughts would race through his mind, stumbling and finally trampling into one another to mold into one concise motion. Time would stand still for the broken island atop the bed. Then the breath would finally come, and the grandson would fall back into his makeshift bed, somewhat disappointed. His mother told him he should go home with his father. He had school in the morning, and he had made his appearance for the day. The grandson shook his head and settled back into the coat, staring at the ceiling. He began to count. 1 towel for every choked breath, 1 towel for every second her breathing stalled. Then the nurse reappeared and the group huddled into the corner. Someone started to cry and someone left the room. The grandson remained where he was, listening to his grandmother's noise. He knew what was happening, but he didn't allow himself to leave the room. He forced himself to stay. Something marvelous was about to take place. He was about to experience one of life's few promises so early in the game. All he had to do was watch. All he could do was watch. The grandson didn't know why he was suddenly so excited. He couldn't explain it in words. A part of him knew that he was one step closer to understanding the mystery of life and death. Only by witnessing the act could he truly gain his bragging right. So when the nurse upped the dose of morphine into his grandmother's bloodstream, he was there at her bedside. Years later, if told to recount the scene, he would state that her last breath was a gargle, as if she had a mouthful of water. He would state that her body sank so low that she almost sank as flat as the mattress, a collapsible piece of furniture inside a soiled gown. The grandson would admit that he had stared down into his grandmother's gaping mouth, past her unhinged jaw, into the dark well of his darkest dreams, to catch a fleeting glimpse of what could be lingering there. But he knew that whatever he was looking for was already gone. He almost wanted to climb into that well and plummet freely into the darkness with nothing to assist him but his own blind faith and utmost understanding. He understood that death was all the same, no matter how it transpired. First there was agony, and then there was peace. There was a loss of sight, hearing, speech, and mind. In another word, peace. How could there be a hell in all that rest? At the bedside he closed his eyes, inhaled through his nose, and held it. Soon the bitter cries from his family members were reduced to slow static, and his body exploded into dust. Brilliant lights lit up the darkness, and he thought that he could almost feel the heat on his face. A charge of pain rippled through his temple, and he came to on the hospital floor, with his family urgently milling around him. But he wasn't hurt. He was renewed somehow. He had tasted the unknown impossible, and it was so good. He wanted an encore. He wished that he were dead. Paul realized that he was driving up to the woods more and more often. He would routinely park his station wagon in one of the isolated parks and trudge up his favorite hiking trail. He knew the area well. There was a detour he could take apart from the path, leading deeper into uncharted territory, where the trees were so close their branches weaved together. Near a massive crumbling boulder, he left the path and disappeared amongst the heavy wood with only a duffel bag over one shoulder. He was never afraid of losing his direction. He had been off the trail too many times. Some 100 yards from the crumbling boulder, he had set up wooden stakes in the earth, each one a close distance from the last. This way he could safely follow the line of stakes another half hour or so into a clearing he liked to call his campground. No other person had ever wandered into his section of the woods. He was certain of that. It was too far from any of the main trails or streams. There the wildlife was rampant. There the air was thick and the brush was even thicker. On the mountain he felt absolutely distant from the outside world, as though stranded on an island somewhere in the Pacific. He ventured into his campground twice a week, once on Wednesdays and once on Sundays, and he stayed for long periods of time. He didn't want to push his luck by visiting more than twice a week. There were the authorities to think of, and the park rangers that he had seen countless times around the area. One Wednesday afternoon, only days after Paul's 25th birthday, he arrived at the clearing with his safety goggles already strapped across his face. With a hungry smile, he set his back down on a nearby tree stump and set about rifling through its contents. From the bag he extracted a rusty axe, which he tossed from one hand to the other, before setting it neatly aside. Somewhere a hawk screamed and took flight over his head. He looked once into the harsh sunlight and flared his nostrils. The sun was much more apparent here, because of the sheer lack of tree cover. It was only a matter of time before a ranger noticed the awkward bald spot on the mountain face and went probing the area. Paul knew that he would have to find a new spot sometime soon. Until then he was going to have a little more fun. Paul grabbed his chainsaw and yanked the pull cord. The calm forest instantly exploded with the saw's grinding snarl, its body spitting black smoke into the air. Paul approached a tree to his left and cut into it, the bark flaking away like dead skin. Once the saw tasted the oak's tough center, it began to groan and tremble in Paul's hands, the smoke clouding his senses. That was always his cue to arc his back and lean all his weight forward. He could feel the entire tree crack and bend. Leaves and pieces of branches rained down on him as confetti amidst a dramatic celebration. He could hear the tree screaming, in his mind and in his ears. In reality, there was only the sound of snapping wood as it gave way to the saw's teeth, but inside his mind, the tree's voice took on a more humanistic nature. The voices died just as the tree's last leg of support buckled. Dust sprayed Paul in the face, and the chainsaw was suddenly eating away at air. Paul almost lost his balance, but caught himself before he could fall forward into the terrifying blade. He was able to kill the saw and catch a breath as the tree toppled to the earth. It struck another neighboring oak, and both seemed to cling to each other with gaunt arms, before the broken giant finally rolled away and smacked the mountain with a tremendous crash. Every treetop swayed as an ominous cloud of airborne dirt overwhelmed the sky. Then everything went still again. Paul sighed and watched a flock of birds make their escape. He sat on the new stump, cleaning the sweat from his face with a handkerchief. After riding the goggles over his eyes and dusting the splinters from his coveralls, he was ready to begin again. He decided to retire the chainsaw for the day, so he returned it to the bag. He would only take one more. His eye caught another tree on the opposite end of the campground. There were already a circle of stumps surrounding this tree, marking the previous homes of its neighbors. He approached the tree with the axe in his hand. At first he caressed the oak's scaly bark and rapped on it with his knuckles, as if to say, "Anybody home?" When nothing appeared to answer, he smiled and stepped back. With a horrible cry, he wound his arm back and threw the axe's blade into the tree. There was a sensation like colliding with a brick wall, and Paul's arm snapped back to his chest like retractable pieces of measuring tape. The axe went pinwheeling into the tall brush, the head and handle completely separate from one another. Paul hit the weeds, clutching his chest and blinking tears of pain from his eyes, which collected in the lips of his goggles. He looked up at the tree with a new sense of unsteadiness. He felt utterly useless beneath this frightening colossus in the sky. What truly startled him, besides the pain in his arms, was the fact that the tree didn't have a scratch on it. He got back on his feet and measured himself before the mighty oak. He touched the place where the axe had struck. There was a slight notch in its side, as though only a bird had pecked it with its beak. Still cradling his arms to his chest, he sawed out his axe from the foliage. He found the steel head and then the handle. He marveled at where the piece of wood had split and broke and where the axe head had actually chipped. The blade was even warped. He looked at the bent piece of steel and then back to the tree, his thoughts sputtering. He threw aside his damaged materials and grabbed the chainsaw. He eyed the tree carefully, pulling the cord. He advanced on the tree and slashed at its belly. There was an obnoxious whine, and the saw's body was forced into his breast. His breath escaped him, and he fumbled to shut it off. When he looked back at the tree, there was only the smallest difference. He pulled the cord again and eased the saw against the tree. The belt around the blade radically slowed, and Paul had a hard time controlling his body. Spurts of dust came away from the bark, but besides that, the teeth weren't making any progress whatsoever. The engine shrieked, and then the belt snapped. The power tool immediately died, and Paul let it fall from his hands. It collided with the earth as a dormant, armored carcass. He inspected the cut in the bark. There was barely enough room for him to insert his thumbnail. Something wasn't right. He couldn't understand why he had failed. All around him was evidence that he had been victorious time and time again. There were too many fallen trees and dry stumps to argue otherwise, so why? Why was this tree, a tree not unlike any of the others, still standing? Defeated and miserable, Paul gathered his broken weapons and stowed them away inside the bag. He decided that he would be back. It wasn't smart to return to the clearing after all he'd done, but he couldn't live with the defeat. He just couldn't accept it. Yes, he would be back, at least one more time, to take care of the unfinished business. Then he would move on to another campground. He gave the tree one last distressed look before exiting the clearing. He found the first marker and began a slow trek back to the main trail. All the while he wore his safety goggles, and by the time he realized he was still wearing them, he was just pulling up into his apartment complex. He figured he could wear them a little while longer. That night he slept with them on. In the parking lot, Grace spotted John's car and hesitated. "Let's just go into the park," she offered. "Come on, I owe you a beer anyway, right?" She smiled and took his arm. "Right." Paul made a mental notation of John's car and tried to memorize his license plate. He didn't know what he was going to do with this information, but it felt like he was getting to know John Krasner bit by bit. The bar was incredibly busy, and there was really nowhere to sit. They stood at the end of the bar and attempted to get the tender's attention. Paul realized that the man serving drinks was the same that had thrown him out the night before. If he could help it, he wanted to steer clear of another altercation. He told Grace to order him a beer, and he crossed the floor. In the guise of walking to the restroom, he was actually looking for John. He smiled when he spotted Krasner near a group of girls. He was staring right at Paul, his eyebrows crossing. "How's it hanging, John?" Paul asked. John instinctively backed up a step or two. "How's your nose?" "Fine, thanks." John looked over at Grace and smirked. "So, you're with her?" "That's right. I didn't think you would mind. You have enough to keep you entertained, am I right?" Paul motioned to the girls at the bar. "I do all right," John said with his eyes closed. He sipped from his glass of beer and turned away from Paul to whisper in a woman's ear. The girl looked up at Paul and stifled laughter. "Good luck," John added. "What?" Paul was noticeably shaking. "Nothing. All I'm saying is that girl is never satisfied. She can't be with just one man," John chuckled. "You look like a pretty serious guy, and let me tell you, she can't be serious." I could have her back in a second. You think I'm serious? Paul said, taking a few steps forward. You think I give a shit about that girl or what you have to say? I could say goodbye to all this. What the hell are you even talking about? John said. The girls laughed and he soon joined them. Paul didn't answer. He walked away, red-faced and sweaty. He could still hear their laughter unfolding behind him, but he couldn't face it. He grabbed Grace by the arm, and once they were outside, he was able to catch his breath. What's wrong? She asked. That didn't go well at all. He crouched low with his head hanging comically. What didn't? Let's go. Before I change my mind, let's go. A short time later, they pulled into the empty parking lot with the last of the sunlight dwindling beyond the trees. He led her up the nearest path, and when he spotted the crumbling boulder, he indicated that they should leave the trail, but she shook her head. It's a shortcut, he said, holding out his hand. There's no one around this late at night, and it's too dark, she argued. If we get lost, we'll be lost until morning, or worse. Somewhere a coyote howled, and Grace shivered, pulling her blouse closed over her chest. Well, I'm going. If you don't want to be left here alone, you better follow, Paul said. He started to walk away. You're a jerk. Why can't we go back to the car and fool around? I'm telling you, this spot is beautiful. We could be eaten. Paul laughed and took her hand. Trust me. Why should I trust you? Good point. Maybe you shouldn't. But I'm still going up there and you can follow if you want. Or go back to the car and wait. You'll get lost. No, there's a marker right there, see? He pointed at a wooden stake hammered into the grass. All we have to do is follow those markers and we'll never get lost. You've done this a lot, haven't you? Grace asked. Of course. But this late at night? No. It should be interesting, though. I'm not going, she insisted, folding her arms. Suit yourself. Paul broke away from the path and crashed through the brush, taking it one marker at a time. In a matter of seconds, he heard footsteps behind him. Grace caught up with him, breathing hard. You're really an asshole, she huffed. He hugged her close, and they both set out along the makeshift trail, keeping their eyes to the ground. When it got too dark to see, Paul shook out a keychain flashlight, and they walked even faster. When Grace started to shiver, he gave her his jacket. And when she complained of sore feet, they stopped and he let her sit on his lap. A half an hour later, they were still hiking, and Grace was losing patience. Come on, let's go back to your place, please, she begged. It's so close, he told her. What is? My campground. Suddenly, Paul whooped with glee and disappeared into the grouping of trees. Grace chased after him and found she was now standing in a clearing. There were fallen trees all around her, along with a graveyard of dry stumps. Paul took a seat on one of the stumps and craned his neck to stare up at the crooked moon. The stars were plentiful, and even Grace had to admit to their stunning beauty. How did all these trees fall over? She asked him. I'm pretty sure this is a logging site. Why would they leave the trees behind? Shouldn't they take it all with them, to make paper and stuff? Grace sat on a neighboring stump, staring longingly up at space. I don't know. Paul got up to kneel between Grace's legs. He started to kiss her hands, tasting her salty skin with his tongue. Paul tried to initiate sex, but she wasn't having any of it. She was too busy staring up at the moon. He gave up and rested his head in her lap. She petted his hair gently. Can I ask you something? He asked her. Yeah. What did you ever see in John Krasner? I don't know. He was kind. He paid attention to me. You know he just wanted to fuck you, right? And I wanted to fuck him. I wanted to fuck you. Paul looked up into her face. How could you want to be with a guy like him? He's terrible. All he does is ever take advantage and tour around like a... What is it with you? She said. In the bar tonight you went right up to John. I saw you. I don't understand why you're so obsessed with him. I'm not obsessed with him. I just hate his guts. You said you didn't even know him. How could you hate someone you don't even know? It's easy, Paul snapped. I can't believe you. She withdrew from the stump and proceeded toward the end of the clearing. Sure, John only had one thing on his mind when he talked to me. But so did you. I saw the way you looked me up and down. That's not all I wanted, Paul retorted. That's true. You wanted to rub me in John's face. You only brought me into that bar tonight to make him jealous. But he wasn't, was he? No, John is never lonely. Paul didn't know what to say. He could only sit there in the grass looking at her stupidly. Grace sighed and sat on a different stump, this time with her back to him. Something inside Paul lifted. He had brought her to the clearing for a reason, other than sex. She stood up and swayed with the cool wind. As he approached her, everything was in slow motion. The trees, the shrubs, and the stars all seemed to smear together. The only thing in focus was Grace's curling hair. His smile was now a wild grimace, and he held meaty hands over his head, as if to catch the wind. Laughter echoed inside Paul's mind, and it wasn't his own. Paul bent down behind Grace and reached for her neck. Inside his mind he was screaming, bathing in gushes of warm blood. I wanted more than you may think, Paul whispered. He placed his hands on her shoulders and squeezed. In his head, he was tearing flesh from bone and howling like a wolf. Paul winced and tightened his fingers around the sides of her neck. He closed his eyes and could see Grace lying dead and heavy in the grass, her tongue hanging out of her open mouth. He saw the red handprints alive on her throat. Cold fingers touched his hands and his grip loosened. Grace turned around and kissed Paul on the forehead. "I know you did," she said. "I'm sorry. You're a good guy, Paul. You're just so angry. You need to learn how to deal with your aggression. It could kill you if you're not careful." His hands fell away from her, and he leaned into her chest. "Are you ready to leave?" he asked her. "Yep." He looked up from her arms, and the tree was there, standing taller than before and crawling with shadow. He remembered how the axe had come apart in his hands and how the chainsaw had overheated. The tree appeared to wave at him, to welcome him back. It had been waiting. The last time he had seen it, the branches had been naked and gnarled, but now they were ordained with healthy buds. It was doing so much better than he was. While he was wasting away in his room, tossing and turning in bed, the tree was thriving alone. Even after all its neighbors had died out, the tree was still fine, if not better. "Let's go," Grace said. She led him back to the first stake, her hand in his. For the second time in a row, Paul left the campground, a failure. Helsing and the Count. Tom was required by the state to wear a respirator, but he wasn't feeling it that morning. He was fully clothed with his hair tied back and his gloves pulled tight over his hands. Yet he didn't want to cover his face. Everything was so damn sterile about his job. That was the only part that absolutely drove him crazy. It was about time to get a little dirty, and besides, it wasn't every day he got to work on a familiar body twice in the same month. His assistant had wheeled the deceased into the room from the refrigerator, and had already placed the body on a stainless steel table. Tom wheeled his tray of instruments closer, and when he took a seat on his stool, he put his face inches from the dead man's nose and blew air over his sunken face. "Remember me?" Tom said. He placed his fingertips over the dry wound in the man's neck, just at the carotid artery. Then he traced his hand down the man's cold arm. Tom grasped the wrist and squeezed. The blood had already been drained, leaving less work for Tom in the embalming room. "If I'd known I'd be seeing you again, I would have embalmed you right then and there," he whispered into the dead man's ear. The last place he probed with his finger was the 1-inch gash in the man's upper thigh, just above the groin. Now the skin was so cold, so leathery. It was lucky that the body had been found early in the morning and not in the afternoon, or there might have been a spoiled banana on his work table. A serial killer, Tom thought to himself. It was the work of a serial killer. The police had never seen anything like it before. There had been steel knitting needles protruding from the body in select places, but not in random places. They had been stuck carefully into the arteries, to drain the man of his blood. An autopsy had been performed, and the cause of death was most certainly from the puncture in the man's neck. Then, as the man had been dead or dying, the rest of the ritual had been performed. A ritual! Tom thought hungrily. He couldn't rightly believe the amount of doom and gloom that was prophesied in the morning headlines. There was a serial killer in Austin, and it was only a matter of time before more turned up dead. In the obituary, it proclaimed that the body of Randolph Morris would be taken to the Green Mortal Funeral Home by that afternoon. Tom had choked on his oatmeal there at his kitchen table. The man he had left naked and blue inside a dumpster would be transported to his workplace, to be entrusted into his hands. The sheer irony was terrifying, but somehow calming. It was all horribly personal for him. It was better that he finished what he began. It was better that he buried the poor son of a bitch. He couldn't ignore the hand he had been dealt. The first human being he had ever murdered was now being forced back into his life. It was as if by taking everything away from the man, he was now forever responsible for him. Randolph Morris, his new orphan pet. That was another thing. The name in the paper. He hated to know that he had killed Randolph Morris instead of some haphazard man he had nabbed from a parking lot. The spontaneity had been so exuberating for Tom, and it was worth looking forward to in the near future. He didn't know when the next urge would strike him, and that was half the fun. But the name ruined everything. It was a lot harder to look at the man inside his embalming room while he still had fresh memories in his head. Memories from the night he had stabbed him in the throat. As Tom got to work, another memory flashed before his eyes. He was 8 years old and his father was taking him by the hand. There were a set of heavy doors that opened on them to reveal a dreary entranceway with mahogany tables and candles and pitchers of flowers. The musty smell hit him first, almost like the smell in a hospital, but a little different. The flowers were there to cover up the heavy musk of death, but Tom could see through it, and he liked that he was able to distance the two. There was a viewing going on, and a man in a suit with clasped hands nodded at him. The coffin had been so shiny and new, Tom could see his face in its glossy coating. He remembered that he was much too short to see over, so his father had to pick him up. Tom shook away the memory, and his head responded with an excruciating ripple of pain. He dug his gloved palms into his forehead, where germicide trickled down his cheeks and spotted his plastic coveralls. When the feeling subsided, he gripped the operating table helplessly, glaring down at his victim with swimming eyes. "Why'd you have to come here?" he spat. He hung his head, crying nauseous orange fluid into the drain between his feet. Tom sighed and pulled the tray closer. First, he washed the body from head to toe with a sponge soaked in germicide. Then he went about gluing the eyelids and mouth shut. After that, he packed cotton into the man's nostrils to reduce that sunken skull-like look. He got up from his stool and retrieved the embalming machine from the other end of the room. With a scalpel, he carefully made an incision in the man's neck and inserted the end of the tube. He switched on the machine and watched the sickly colored embalming fluid inch its way up the hollow plastic. He sat back and watched, and every once in a while massaged a few places on the body where the fluid was collecting. He watched as the dyes inside the bloodstream gradually altered the pale flesh into a bright new hue to temporarily mask the calamity of death and its sheer ugliness. The man came back to life for a moment, only a moment, before Tom threw a tarp over him. Once his shift was over, Tom stripped off his plastic uniform and fluffed up his collar before the mirror. He ducked out of the cold embalming room and resurfaced inside the parlor, where one of the directors was speaking quietly with a woman between a stocky man's arms. Tom knew who these people were, Mr. and Mrs. Morris. Tom wondered if they had read the paper that morning. Of course they had. The woman caught Tom's eyes and they locked. He froze before the front door, his hand just turning the knob. For that split second, her face relaxed and her chin dropped to her chest. Without her even knowing it, she had stared into the eyes of her son's killer and had found the strength to look away. Tom tried to give her a small professional smile, a sympathetic gesture, not showing any teeth or gums, just a slight lift of the lips, but she had already planted her face back into her husband's chest. Hands slowly caressed her unwashed hair. Tom opened the door. "Can you believe what they're calling him?" asked the father as he petted his wife's head. "The pin and needle killer. How sick is that?" "Yeah," Tom thought as he stepped out into the sunlight. So fucking sick. His job was starting to get to him. He couldn't possibly keep it as long as he was living a double life as the pin and needle killer. The lawyer was bad enough, but once the old man came into the home, he almost screamed in terror. Everything was coming back to crush him into the ground. He remembered that he had gone into the bathroom after fixing up the woman, and cried until his head hurt and his stomach lifted. He vomited into the toilet and lay there on the ground, watching through the gap under the door to make sure he was alone, and then he had cried some more. He couldn't possibly be an embalmer for the victims he had murdered the week before. It was too much for him to handle. He was starting to experience the itch again, gnawing at the back of his head and scrambling his vision. The day before, he had watched a young kid walking home from school and had almost pursued him. He had been too afraid of seeing the boy again on that cold steel slab. It was more than just a nightmarish case of deja vu. It was like working on the same project twice. Even when he knew it was perfect the first time around, he liked to remember the woman as he had last seen her, with the biblical message spelled out across her chest with thumbtacks. To see her second time with her wounds scrubbed clean made him sick. Before, she had been a work of art, but in the mortuary, she was just a dead woman, and he had killed her. Tom was going to quit. He was driving himself crazy there inside the funeral home, forever haunted by life-size ghosts from his past. Both of his jobs were overlapping, and that could not happen. Now he had to pick one or the other. Once he was forced to choose, he realized it wasn't much of a competition. His job as an embalmer had never felt like a career anyway. Even after the several years he had spent in school, it was more like a hobby, so that he wouldn't have to think so much about the outside. But now that he was experimenting on his own living and breathing subjects, he didn't need to dress up dead bodies for immediate families. No. What he had on the outside was much more satisfying. He figured that he could still take what he had learned in school and put it to good use. In truth, there really wasn't much of a difference between Tom and the pin and needle killer. They both dealt in death. But Tom was a lot more formal with his work. The killer only wanted to create art. On July 13th, he decided to put in his 2 weeks' notice and think about taking a job elsewhere. In all honesty, he was tired of the city. There wasn't another funeral home he wanted to apply for, not while he was busy leaving bodies for the trashmen to discover. He could never go back to professionally mixing and injecting chemicals. A part of him felt dislodged. He had always identified himself with his job. But now that he was moving on, all he had left was that sinister title slapped across every newspaper in the country. PNK for short, Tom thought to himself. It would be fine. Over the years, he had gradually smuggled fluids and instruments from his work home with him. Without them, he wouldn't have been able to drain his victims with such precision. He supposed he could start embalming the bodies now, to save some poor guy the hassle. He knew he would have appreciated it. He could see himself working out of his own basement. But would he stay in Austin, and over time let the police hone in on him? When he thought of going back home to Colorado, something inside him stirred. He would have to be patient. There was his house to consider, and the money he would surely need to travel. He supposed he had enough in savings. He didn't spend much, and he would only have to buy an apartment at first. Then he would have to find something more suitable for his needs, something with a lot more wiggle room. Excitement flowered inside his chest, churning his stomach. He couldn't wait. That day he put in a call at Mackenzie Realty. Helsing. Harvey Miller got his first call of the morning around 6 a.m. He was just hanging up his coat inside the closet when the phone screamed. He didn't answer it right away. He sat down in his swivel chair and tapped on his desk. Then he put the receiver to his ear, said hello, and gave his name. "Hello, this is Sheriff Harvey Miller," a man's voice asked. "This is him? Harvey Miller from Lakeshore, Colorado?" "Yes, can I help you?" "I'm calling about the story in the paper." Harvey popped a toothpick into his mouth and softened it with his tongue. He looked over at the front door, where the front page of yesterday's paper was hanging crooked from 2 thumbtacks. "What story would that be?" he asked. "The pin and needle killer. I read that a body was found with similar lacerations as the bodies in Austin." "Well, you can read." "Yes, fine. I'm calling from Texas. I think this story has gone national. Not that I'm surprised," the man said. "How'd you get this number?" "Look, I won't take any more of your time. I don't know. The coincidence is too much for me to ignore." "Well, by all means, spit it out." "My name is Larry Spaulding, and I manage the Green Mortal Funeral Home here in Austin. I noticed in the papers that the woman was discovered with her body embalmed. Is that correct?" "Yes, the blood was drained as usual, but the killer went a step further this time." "I recently employed a man down here for 2 years. He was fresh out of college and he showed all the qualifications. I employed him as an embalmer. Anyway, a few months ago he quit, which was shocking. As far as I knew, he loved his job. But he told me he was moving and he would be selling his house." Miller straightened in his seat. "Did he tell you where he was moving?" "To Colorado. He told me he was going back home to Colorado." "Jesus. What's his name, Mr. Spaulding?" "Thomas Griffith. So you think it could be him?" "It's a lead. Before today we had nothing to go off. No prints or semen or saliva. No one has spotted his car or his person. He's as careful and quiet as a mouse. On the other hand, maybe he's not that careful." "Dear God, Sheriff, he worked on their bodies," Spaulding blurted. "What's that?" Miller was waving others into his office. "My funeral home took in the last 2 victims, and he was the one that embalmed them." Miller was scrolling notes into an open notebook, and he handed it over to the nearest police officer. "Can I get your home phone number and address, Mr. Spaulding? We will keep in touch." The kid was forced into the office, and a set of strong hands pushed him into a chair. Teller came up from behind him and tapped his shoulder. The kid looked around frantically, and at once began to rehearse his side of the story. Teller ignored every word, and instead turned on his radio. Loud rock and roll flooded the office, forcing the kid to speak louder. Teller only adjusted the volume. "I'm telling you, man, I didn't have anything to do with that murder in the mountains. I have an alibi. I was living with this chick in Fort Collins," the kid shouted, rocking in his chair. He bitterly yanked at the handcuffs around his wrists. Teller turned the radio down. "We're waiting on some people, okay, son? Then we'll hear everything you have to say." "I can explain the car if that's what this is all about." "Yeah, that's what this is all about." Teller took a seat on the other end of the desk. "I can explain everything. I can—" "Sorry I'm late, Ralph." Harvey Miller entered the office at a slow jog and came to a stop once he spotted the man in handcuffs. "This is him then?" Harvey asked. Henry Miller entered his office at a wide stride and came to a stop once he spotted the man in handcuffs. "This is him then?" Harvey asked. Teller offered him a chair, but he passed it up. He stood directly in front of the man and tapped his foot. "Where'd you find him?" "He was pumping gas a few miles down the road. A cruiser ran his license plate and it matches with the Griffith fellow," Teller explained. "Obviously his appearance doesn't match." Miller took a seat on the desktop and adjusted his pants. In the process, he made sure to touch the holster hooked to the belt, and the kid seemed to notice. "What's his name?" asked Miller. "You can ask me, asshole. I'm right here," the kid spat. "I'll talk to you when I'm damn ready." The kid hung his head and his hands went limp. "His name is Tobias Stevens. He grew up in Texas, but now seems to be living in that car," Teller answered. "The car right outside? That's Griffith's Jeep?" "That's the one." Miller turned on the kid. "Now, how did you come to possess this vehicle?" "I found it." "You found it? What, with the keys in the ignition?" "That's right," Tobias smiled. "See, you get it." "He's a fucking rambler," Miller advised Teller. "Yeah, he does talk a lot." "No, I mean he's a hitchhiker. Griffith must have picked him up somewhere near the city." "And what did you do, Tobias? How'd you convince him to give you his car?" "I have a way with words," Tobias replied. "He told me he wanted to ditch his car. He was on the run or something. I said I'd take it, and I dropped him off at a gas station." "You didn't happen to drop him off at exit ramp?" Miller broke off to free a piece of paper from his hip pocket. "Exit ramp E217? You didn't happen to leave him at the side of the road, did you?" No, a gas station, like I said. A girl was found near exit ramp E217 with her brains bashed in. She was lying in 2 feet of water, with her body bloated like a balloon. Tobias' face went sour. Why are you telling me this shit? Because, Tobias, you stole Mr. Griffith's car at this supposed gas station, and because he was desperate for transportation, he flagged this woman down and killed her. Because of you, she's dead. Tobias shook his head. No, man, you can't blame me for this. Blame that sick fuck. I didn't have anything to do with it. Miller pocketed the piece of paper. What was in the car, Ralph? Just this. Teller passed Miller a battered copy of Dracula. Everything else belongs to the kid. Was that Griffith's? Miller asked Tobias. Yeah, that's his. What else was in the car? Well, beside the kid's clothes, Miller motioned for Teller to stop. I was talking to Mr. Stevens. What else was in the car that specifically belonged to Griffith? He had some suitcases full of clothes. I got rid of that stuff. So all you kept of his was this book? Why? I like the cover. Okay, you're coming with me, kid, Miller told him. The car can stay here. I'll put him in the back of my cruiser. Do I have to fill out any paperwork for Stevens here? Nah, Jefferson and Lakeshore are in the same jurisdiction, Teller said. You're free to take him. I just feel bad that you had to come all the way down here. Don't worry about it, Ralph. Miller grabbed Tobias by the arm and hauled him to his feet. What are you going to do with me? The kid asked. You're going to identify Griffith if you can. So, Harvey, you want to tell me what you found inside the guy's home? Teller inquired. You didn't hear it on the news? Nope, the cable guy's coming next week. We found the victim's blood and some instruments. He had his own private mortuary set up. He also had a name tag for the dog-eared bookstore underneath his couch. He had been working there for 2 months, and the manager told us that he simply hadn't shown up for work on Monday. We also have a description for a Ford pickup. White. I'm sure the license plate has already been faxed to your station. We did get that. Thank you, Harvey. Teller stood up and they shook hands. Thank you, Ralph. He ushered Tobias out the door. How do you know this guy's still in your town? Teller asked. I don't, Miller called back. At 9:20 p.m., Miller was parking outside of Ray's bar. There were already 2 cop cars on the scene, with their red lights flashing. Over his radio, someone was shouting instructions. In the back seat, Tobias heard it all. Someone had been shot outside of a bar. Miraculously, he was still alive, and an ambulance had already swung by. Miller got out of the car, but Tobias stopped him. Hey man, can I take a piss? Tobias asked. We've been driving for hours. You're going to have to hold it for a while longer. This is a crime scene, Miller answered before slamming his door closed. Then let me piss in the goddamn bushes. Hello? He watched through the window as Miller joined 4 other cops. One of the men pointed at a car that was missing its windshield, and then at a red spot in the gravel. Miller looked back at his cruiser and the men did the same. Tobias relaxed into his seat to avoid their stares. Miller returned a few minutes later and put his car into gear. Where are we going? Tobias asked. Crazy, Miller answered. Was it the pen and needle dude? Is he still around here? We're looking for an emerald green station wagon, Mr. Stevens. If you can keep your eyes peeled, I'll make sure your holding cell is finally furnished, Miller said. Promise me I'll have the cell to myself, and you have a deal, Tobias added. Deal. Miller sped up the road. He noted the cold skid marks leading up the wrong side of the street and pointed them out to his passenger. Listen, if you want me to concentrate, you have to let me take a piss, Tobias said from the back seat. It's excruciating, man. Come on, just pull over somewhere. You know that's illegal, right? Forget that you're a fucking cop for 1 second and show me some mercy. Miller eyed Tobias through the rearview mirror. Do you realize a man was almost killed tonight? Does that matter at all to you? And I'm about to die. Does that matter at all to you? Tobias, you met this guy. You know how dangerous he can be. We can't waste any time. Actually, he was pretty cool to me. I was the one that kind of fucked him over. Only you, Tobias, could piss off a wanted murderer. I'm about to wet my pants. I've been stuck in this car all day in handcuffs listening to your fucking music. I haven't asked you one thing besides pull over and let me... Miller swerved over to the shoulder and hit the brakes. Tobias hit his head against the cage separating the front and back seats. Jesus, he screamed. Miller got out and tore open Tobias's door. Do it already. Tobias stumbled out into the dark and disappeared amid the tall brush. You better speed it up, Miller advised the air. He leaned against his hood and listened to Tobias piss into the grass. Something caught his eye. His headlights were pointed directly across the road at the turnoff for the Tar Creek Park. He knew the place well. Often he took his family hiking up Deer Mountain to see the waterfall. That night there was a sign lying in the bushes. He jogged closer and saw that it was a yield sign. A car had come by and completely leveled it, most likely as it turned. Miller sprinted back to the car and yelled for Tobias to get in. What's up? Tobias asked. God bless you, Stevens, you might have made the night. Tobias climbed into a seat and they accelerated away from the shoulder. Where are we going? Into the park. Tobias shook his head. The park? What park? The emerald green station wagon was there, along with one other car, a car Miller did not recognize. It was a white convertible, and it was parked just as askew as the wagon. He got out of the car and inspected both vehicles. The wagon hadn't been driven in quite some time, but the convertible's engine was still popping from recent use. He ran back to his cruiser and got on the radio. I'm going to need some backup at Tar Creek Park. Front entrance in the parking lot. I found our car, he said. 10 seconds after placing his radio back into the cradle, a male voice was responding, and then another. What are you going to do? Tobias asked. I guess I'll go a little ways up the trail and keep my ears open, Miller answered. Do you think it's him? Miller responded by closing the door. You're not going to leave me in here, are you? You can't just leave me here with a killer on the loose, Tobias cried, but Miller was already climbing the dirt path with his gun drawn. This is bullshit! Miller heard the shots, but they were so far away. Some seemed closer than others. He heard them all the same. He thought he could count 6 in all. He waited a few minutes and did not hear anything more. He had a flashlight on his belt, but he couldn't risk another party discovering his light. The best thing he could do was return to the parking lot and wait for the backup. So that is what he did, though very slowly. Every few steps he would crouch low and wait under a tree, his ears perked and his trigger finger ready. Then he would hike another minute or so and repeat his method. He couldn't hear a damn thing beside the wind in the trees and some lazy crickets. He decided to hurry. Further up the trail, he thought he could hear some loud breathing. He turned in mid-step and fell backward into a rock pile. He saw stars for a brief moment, and then realized that he was no longer carrying his gun. Desperately, he felt around him, tearing through the weeds and clods of dirt. The breathing was becoming more and more apparent. He could hear heavy footsteps like the hooves on a horse, and still his gun was nowhere to be found. He scrambled into the tall bushes, cutting open his hands and breaking the seams on his uniform. When the oncoming footsteps were too much to bear, he lay flat on his stomach and waited for them to pass. Inside his mind, he ran through all his options. He had a handheld taser on his belt and an unused can of pepper spray. Besides that, he had nothing to defend himself against a man with a loaded gun, so he hid in the bush by the side of the road, holding his breath and counting the seconds. The man passed through without even slowing. Miller could tell he was running, and relatively fast for such a steep trail so late at night. Miller prayed the cavalry was just pulling in. He hoped there was a gang of police cruisers waiting for the bastard, with 20 guns or more aimed at his chest. He wanted help. There was no way he could do this himself. Even after he knew the man was well beyond earshot, Miller remained in the bushes, listening to the crickets. His eyes were closed, and he was trying to listen to the loud voices of his comrades. He wanted to hear that everything was fine. Tom Griffith was in custody, or better yet, he was dead. He couldn't move. Every time he tried to crawl out of his little alcove, his muscles would tense and he would start to hyperventilate. Never before had he feared so much for his own life. Even with a gun, he didn't think he could stand up to the pin and needle killer. He heard gunshots from the parking lot. He could hear glass breaking and blood-curdling screams. Miller still couldn't move. He began to pray. The Count. Epilogue. Tom stepped off the path at exactly 10:30 p.m. and froze when he saw the police cruiser. He looked around and did a series of double takes. He tore Paul's car keys out of his pocket and made for the convertible. Then he noticed something moving inside the cop car, and he had to go in for a closer look. The movement wasn't from the driver's seat. It was coming from the back. He peered in through the glass and met Tobias Stevens for the second time. Tobias was huddled against the far window, staring at Tom with grave eyes. His hands were handcuffed and held up in front of his face, the fingers outsplayed. Everything about him was shaking. I can't believe it, Tom said. His breath fogged over the window. I don't believe it. He smiled and shot at the glass. Tobias screamed and Tom fired again. The second bullet lodged into Tobias's thigh, and the third blew a hole in the seat's upholstery. Tobias was kicking his legs against the door, and the chains to his handcuffs were clinking on the window above his head. Why'd you do it? Tom asked before aiming another shot. You tell me why. A fourth bullet cleared out the other window and glass rained down over Tobias's hair. His screams were drowned out by the last gunshot, but by the time the clip was empty, Tobias was still alive. He was whimpering against his seat, his hands over his eyes. He wasn't kicking or yelling. He was submissive, and the ultimate sign of acceptance. Tom dropped the pistol and backed away from the police car. When there wasn't another gunshot, Tobias peeked out behind his fingers and watched Tom cross the parking lot. Tom jammed the keys into the convertible, but could not force himself to open the door. He fell over against the top of the cabin, trying frantically to keep his heels planted on the ground. I made a mistake, he said. I made a mistake. He collapsed into the driver's seat and hugged the steering wheel with both arms. He shut his eyes and gritted his teeth. Tears trickled down his cheeks. and collected with his welling saliva. God help me. I've made a mistake. The darkness ruptured with red lights, and somewhere Tom could hear a howl progressively gaining on him from the mouth of a determined but hungry beast. Tune in next time for Tales from the Cracks, numbers 55 through 57. Until then, guard your soul.